hosting this event, which is part of a bigger project about the decolonization of English in higher education, and which investigates issues of empowerment, access, sociocultural diversity, and global citizenship in ELT in multilingual universities in Colombia, Mexico, Iraq, Thailand, and Vietnam. And we also want to thank our colleagues from different higher education institutions in Mexico, from the states of Guanajuato, Campeche, Chiapas, San Luis Potosí, Durango, UAM, the universities in Mexico City, two of the main universities, biggest universities in Mexico. In Campeche, our special thanks to our colleagues from Honduras, and shortly our colleague and friend from Argentina, she will be joining us hopefully. And let me introduce our guest speakers, who are also the lead researchers of the project I just mentioned, Dr. Sonia Moran Panero and Dr. Will Baker from the University of Southampton in the UK. Thank you, Will and Sonia. We do appreciate you are here, and we do appreciate your time for having this conversation with our colleagues. And a special thanks to all my friends and colleagues from Universidad Veracruzana, from the different campuses, from north to south, central part of Mexico, language centers, research centers, etc., and language centers, the School of Languages in Jalapa. Thank you for being here. So let me introduce Dr. Sonia Moran Panero. Sonia is a lecturer in applied linguistics and a member of the Center for Global English Research at the University of Southampton in the UK. Her research expertise is on sociolinguistics of language use in the era of globalization, with a focus on the use and learning of English as a lingua franca for transcultural communication purposes. She's particularly interested in the investigation of English language ideologies, policies, and symbolic practices in Spanish-speaking settings. Sonia has disseminated her work on these and other topics through international academic outlets such as the ELT Journal, the Journal of English as a Lingua Franca, the Routledge Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca, and diverse academic conferences, invited talks, and workshops. She recently became the reviews editor for the Journal of English as a Lingua Franca and a co-editor for New Cambridge Element series in intercultural communication. At present, Sonia is co-editing a volume on English as a Lingua Franca in Latin America, Educational Perspectives. Dr. Will Baker is an associate professor of applied linguistics and director of the Center for Global Englishes at the University of Southampton in the UK. His research interests are intercultural and transcultural communication, English as a lingua franca, English medium education, intercultural education, intercultural citizenship and ELT, and he has published and presented internationally in all these areas. Recent publications include Baker and Ishikawa, Transcultural Communication in Global Englishes. Co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca, and co-editor of the book series Developments in English as Lingua Franca and Cambridge Elements in Intercultural Communication. Again, thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Will, for your time. So let me explain the dynamics of our colloquium. Today, we want this time and this space to have a conversation with all of you. First, we will listen to Sonia, and then we will open the microphone to all of you. And we kindly ask you to limit your participation to 3 minutes. And after 2 minutes, I'm sorry for that, but we will have to turn off the microphone so we have, or most of you have the time to have a chat. We are really interested in having conversations instead of having the expert to tell us what to do or what it is all about. We do want to share, and we do want to learn from each other and to talk about our own experiences. Okay, so Sonia, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Gloria, for the kind introduction. Hello to everyone. Hola, bienvenidos from wherever you're connecting. I am going to share my screen, so bear with me for a second while I try to successfully share my slides. I also hope you can hear me okay. Do let me know if not at any point. And hopefully now you can see the slides. Yeah. Okay, excellent. So yes, Will and I both feel very lucky to be connecting from Quintana Roo today. And we have prepared two separate presentations, and I am going to start. The first part of the session is going to be encouraging us to think about what is decolonial theory and how it relates to how we conceptualize English language or language in general and English language in particular. So this is the outline of the short talk that I will give. I will start by saying a little bit about us, about Will and myself, and our trajectory as researchers, and how we link or how our work links with the notion of decolonization. Then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how we may understand what decolonization is, what it means, bearing in mind that there is not one single approach to decolonization. There's not one single way of understanding it. There are different scholars discussing how to understand decolonization in different ways, but I will try to convey how we understand it so far. And then I will move on to discuss how we think this notion relates to English language, how we think about it, and also how do we research it and how do we describe it in academia. And then I will talk about ELF research or English as a lingua franca research, which is an area of expertise that Will and I both share. And I will try to discuss to what extent do we think that the kind of research we do in ELF is a colonial approach or a decolonial approach. So just a quick picture of us as researchers in the Center for Global English in Southampton. You can see the building we are normally working in behind us. You can probably see us there as well, although the picture is actually quite old. So maybe audience members cannot recognize us anymore. But basically we are a lively center and we have PhD students, staff and PhD students from different parts of the world. And between us, we tend to research different dimensions of the use of English as a lingua franca for intercultural communication purposes. And we tend to look at this in educational and non-educational domains or settings of interaction. So quite a wide range of research domains, but we tend to draw from theoretical frameworks that are informed by global Englishes, English as a lingua franca, inter or transcultural communication ideas, translanguaging as well. And we also, as you can see on the slide, address a wide diverse of concerns, a range of concerns in relation to the use of English as a lingua franca, from the study of language attitudes and ideologies to the study of the notion of global citizenship and global citizenship education, and a number of other areas. So we are currently working on a research project, as Gloria kindly indicated, called Decolonising English in Higher Education. This is the project that has brought us to Mexico and to Quintana Roo especially. And Gloria already introduced briefly the main interests of our project. I'll just show you a little bit more. I'm just going to move the images so I can see the slides. Bear with me. Here we go. So we are interested in this project in exploring to what extent English may be able to bring together and to empower students from diverse communities, which are also often marginalized. We are also interested in checking to what extent English may be taught as a language of empowerment that belongs to all that use it, or to what extent English Anglophone colonial ideologies may be reproduced in the teaching of English, and to what extent this may contribute to further marginalizing different groups of learners in all of these 5 settings where we are carrying out research, and particularly at the Universidad Intercultural Maya de Quintana Roo in Mexico. So in this project, we work with a number of different key notions to inform the research, and one of them is decoloniality, although we could say that ELF research has started engaging with notions of decolonial thinking and decolonial theory not long ago, or relatively late, if we put it that way. We think that decoloniality is actually a key notion to embed in our project. So to try to discuss or convey what decoloniality means, we should probably start by considering what is coloniality. So we have a slide here that shows this information. We see, as for instance, Meneses de Sousa argues that we should distinguish between the notion of colonialism, which refers to historical processes of political and geographical colonization, and the notion of coloniality, which is something else, right? So the colonial scholars tend to argue that whilst colonialism has sort of ended, or at least the kind of colonialism that was carried out by European countries has ended, coloniality is still lingering, is still visible in different parts of the world nowadays. So coloniality would refer to lingering unequal power, knowledge, race relations, and resources that tend to be controlled and reproduced in the name of development. And these kind of unequal power relations and resources at the same time define which knowledges are valid or validated, and which knowledges are not, and what ways of being a human being can be recognized as being a full citizen or not. So, okay, so that's what coloniality is. So decoloniality, to some extent, refers to the need to fight and resist this kind of lingering unequal relations or dynamics. Mignolo, for instance, talks about the need for us to resist or fight global designs. So he talks about global designs as local knowledges or histories that are spread by a particular group of powerful individuals, and which are then presented as global and universal ways of knowing the world. So scholars in the decolonial turn would argue that we need to challenge the dominance or the violence of this kind of global designs, or also what may be known as epistemologies of the North or Northern epistemologies. And we should create spaces or validate or revalidate knowledges or epistemologies that have been discriminated as a result of these unequal dynamics, which would be the epistemologies of the South. One important point to keep in mind, according to decolonial theory, is that the global North and the global South, or these kind of epistemologies, do not refer to geographical positions, but are instead referring to epistemologies or worldviews. So for instance, you could be a researcher that's based in the geographical North, but you could be defending and reproducing or constructing epistemologies from the South at the same time. I hope that makes sense, but if not, we can discuss later. Okay, so how do we recognize what is an epistemology of the North or what are global designs? Here, Mignolo again gives us some clues. For instance, he talks about global designs as epistemologies where there's a primacy of reason over the senses, experiences, and subjectivities, where we see efforts to homogenize across the planet, or an inability to think outside of your own worldview, or what he calls territorial thinking. And we may discuss, perhaps in the second part of today's session, maybe to what extent the kind of English that we see in English as a foreign language education, whether we could call this a global design, for instance, or not. So Mignolo also, as well as other researchers in this field of studies, tries to give us clues as to how we may resist this kind of global designs. So he recommends we need to decolonize the mind, we need to engage in border thinking or an other thinking, we need to delink from modern and colonial ideas. We need to denaturalize concepts and fields of study that totalize realities. And we need to question any desires to promote a single way of life. These may now seem a little bit abstract at the moment, but I am about to start discussing what this means for English language or for language. And hopefully they will begin to seem less abstract and more concrete ideas. Okay, so what does it mean for English? How do we conceptualize it and how do we go about researching it? Well, one question that may quickly come to mind if we're thinking about decoloniality and English is whether we could think that or conclude that English is inherently a colonial or an imperialistic language. And this is a question that has actually been explored for a number of decades, I would say, as part of the linguistic imperialism theory. For instance, we have here a quote from Robert Philipson, who would argue that the efforts behind linguistic imperialism during periods of colonization they represent the dominance asserted by the establishment and continuous reconstitution of structural inequalities between English and other languages. And I think most researchers in the field would actually agree to some extent that we can observe that those kind of linguistic imperialism efforts, or we have seen them historically, but we don't always agree with Widdowson in terms of the kinds of conclusions he reaches about what are the effects of linguistic imperialism today. So he would argue, for instance, that the spread of English tends to lead to more cultural, symbolic, and even cognitive homogenization of the world. But this is where ELF researchers and researchers in a number of other areas actually depart from Philipson's understanding. We don't quite agree with that statement. And this is because in research fields like World Englishes, Global Englishes, and ELF, we probably would argue that coloniality is not in a language intrinsically, but instead coloniality is about the gaze, is about the epistemologies with which we look at English, with which we describe English, how we talk about it, and also how we teach it and learn it. Yeah. In fact, we would argue that research in World Englishes and Global Englishes and ELF has been for quite some time questioning dominant and homogenizing global designs that try to tell the world what English is or what good English is. And research in these areas has collected plenty of evidence that actually as speakers learn English as a second or as an additional language, they seem to also develop some ownership over it, they appropriate it, they transform it, they assign new meanings to the language, and they use it to communicate different meanings that are relevant to them. So far from imitating Anglophone identities or Anglophone cultural norms, what we see is that speakers actually perform complex cultural affiliations through the use of English as a lingua franca or as a multilingua franca. So this, considering this kind of evidence, we could perhaps conclude instead that multilingual speakers of English already tend to decolonize English in their everyday communicative practices, whether they do this consciously or subconsciously. Perhaps a lot of speakers or a great number of speakers decolonize English in their practices by transforming it at a sort of subconscious level, and this coexists at the same time. Their practices coexist with an explicit or conscious understanding that departing from native speaker models or researchers' traditional models of what English is actually signaling a sort of invalid skills or invalid knowledge. Okay, so there's a little bit of a tension there. And this is why we would argue that even though speakers might be decolonizing English in their practices, we also need to decolonize our minds. So we need to decolonize how we think about what English is and what counts as good English. Perhaps it's not surprising that this effort is needed, because those that have traditionally been seen as experts of language, academics in the field, they have also been working with sort of monolithic ideas about what English is, and dominant descriptions of English were historically based on how native speakers use the language alone, and their senses of grammar were thought to be the only reliable sources of descriptions of the language. And therefore, any departure that was observed by second language users would be automatically considered an error or a sign of low proficiency. And this has also been translated into how the English language teaching industry has designed the principles of their teaching endeavors, but we'll discuss that in more detail later. Okay, so even researchers need to decolonize their minds when they approach language research. I think it's important to actually acknowledge that this has been understood for quite some time in applied linguistics, and there are a number of researchers doing critical work in lots of different applied linguistics areas, from ELF to SLA. Where there's a joint effort of trying to identify how dominant monolingual ideologies about language and native speaker ideologies of language have been contributing to the construction of these kind of monolithic descriptions of English, and therefore how we need to deconstruct those and how we need to carry out research in different ways. So we obviously particularly produce work within the English as a lingua franca paradigm, and we would argue that the kind of work that is produced in ELF studies actually aligns itself with a decolonial agenda, although at the same time some researchers have sometimes positioned ELF studies as a colonial academic approach or a Western theory, but we don't quite agree with that, and I'll try to explain why that is. So basically on the slides you can see how we define our field of studies, our object of studies. We have a famous definition by Professor Jennifer Jenkins, who talks about ELF as English being used as a lingua franca among speakers who come from different lingua cultural backgrounds. And then we have a more recent definition in which she talks about English as a multilingua franca, and she highlights that in these cases, that in ELF research, we're dealing with multilingual communicative settings or with multilingual communication. So she's decentering the relevance of English resources and understanding that we need, and sort of suggesting that we need to pay more attention to other linguistic resources in our multilingual repertoires. So what ELF researchers, when ELF researchers study how ELF communication takes place, the conclusions they tend to reach in a general way is that we're dealing with multilingual users and repertoire. So therefore, this is a multilingual practice. And while there is some repetition and some sameness in terms of how we communicate with each other, we can also see a lot of variability and variation in these kind of interactions. So far from seeing a homogenizing orientation where everyone orients to Anglophone norms, what we see is that norms and linguistic forms tend to be negotiated instead. And this is why in ELF studies, we are not talking about ELF as a language or a variety or a set of varieties. As Ferguson puts very well in this quote, this is precisely the point about ELF. It eludes traditional categorizations. So if we try to think about the ways of resisting global designs that Mignolo proposed and that I showed you earlier, we could see that actually ELF research engages in the linking and denaturalizing of hegemonic concepts that we used to use in applied linguistics research in the past. Yet we don't rely on the notion of variety or a language as such to study this kind of communicative practices. Another example of the linking traditional hegemonic concepts is how ELF studies has repositioned non-native speakers of English. So as we can see here, these speakers can no longer be assumed to be deficient when their English departs from English native standards, and instead of describing their different uses as deficits, we tend to use metaphors of difference, contact, and performativity. So we say that multilingual speakers of English as a lingua franca are remaking English in their own terms, according to their own needs, audiences, and knowledge of other languages. Also, it's important to highlight and emphasize that in ELF research, we do not consider ELF communication to be taking place in some sort of socio-political vacuum. So we don't consider it's a neutral activity. And instead, we are very interested as researchers in looking at how identities, social meanings, power, ideologies are all involved in the and influencing the use of English and other multilingual resources that we observe in ELF communication. So rather than just trying to describe what we see when we study ELF communication or ELF interactions, we also often want to understand users' own conceptualizations of the language, what are their use and their communication goals, and what are their identification goals as well. So linking back to global designs and decolonial theory, I would say that this is an example of how we revalorize the importance of senses and subjective experience in understanding ELF communication and what English means to different people in different parts of the world as well. So just to summarize very quickly before we give space for discussion, I guess one key point to take away is that despite historical efforts to push totalizing models of English, we can argue that English resources are not inherently colonial. We can in fact see that multilingual speakers across the world challenge dominant models in their everyday linguistic practices when they appropriate and transform English themselves. But at the same time, decolonizing English requires addressing how we look and how we talk about English and going beyond the decolonization of the mind onto other forms of action too, in terms of considering what are the terminologies that we use, the discourses that we produce, the evaluative practices that we also may engage with when we are describing our English use and that of others, and also, of course, when we design our own research studies. And even though some researchers perhaps would not agree, and despite the irony in that it is both Will and myself arguing about ELF as a decolonial approach today, and we are both affiliated with two nations that have a historical past of colonialism, decolonization, we still argue, obviously, that ELF research, among other fields in applied linguistics, actually contributes to processes of decolonization, so that it's in line with this kind of agenda. So I will stop there. I'd like to say thank you very much. Gracias for listening to this part of the talk. And before I give you all some opportunity to interact with us as well, here are 3 questions that we would like to pose for the to share with the audience in case you want to discuss this. One is, how do you understand the notion of decolonization? What does it mean to you? How do you see the relationship between English and coloniality or decoloniality? Do you think it's possible to decolonize English? And how do you see ELF theory or ELF research? Do you see it as a decolonizing epistemology or contributing to colonial global designs in some ways, and why? Of course, if you have questions that are different to this, we will be very happy to answer your questions too. So yeah, I'll stop there and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you for saving us all the time to read all the bibliography about decolonization. You gave us a very, very clear summary, and you certainly made us think about the meaning of coloniality, yeah, and how can we decolonize ELT, and it's an interesting talk to start thinking of taking the abstract to more specifics. And we do have some hands raised. And let me see, as I can see Maestro Moises. Would you please say your name and from where you are connecting, please, your university?
Hi, yes, my name is Moises Perales, and I'm connecting from Universidad de Quintana Roo in Mexico. So I have a question. It's a question that's been on my mind for quite a while. I'm going to talk about a fact that, or something I perceive as a fact, and then I'm going to ask what this fact means for the ELF agenda. So to me, it is a fact that the very authors and journals that advocate for ELF continue to publish in standard academic English. And then how does that have an impact on the ELF agenda if these journals and scholarly publications and scholarly activity about ELF is published not in any form of ELF, to my knowledge, but in standard English?
Okay, thank you, Moises, very much for this question. It is a big and complicated question, and a very important one, I think. I agree with you in this respect. I'm not sure that I would say that all publications or all the platforms, all the academic platforms in which ELF researchers publish follow standard academic English necessarily. In some places, I'm sure ELF researchers submit articles, and in some cases, I am aware that the editors of those journals ask those researchers to have their academic papers proofed by a native speaker. I think Will might have some specific examples himself. And sometimes ELF researchers are successfully able to argue that they are not going to standardize their paper for the reasons probably explained in the paper. Sometimes I'm not sure we're always successful. On the other hand, there are some publication platforms like the Journal of English as a Lingua Franca, and certainly the edited volumes that are published by colleagues in ELF. Normally, a big policy in these publications and these platforms is that we do not ask the contributors to have any native speaker check their paper, and we do not require any corrections that have to do with following Anglophone academic or standard academic English. So we might only comment on the writing of the submissions if we understand that there may be intelligibility issues or the content doesn't seem to be expressed sufficiently clearly. So I think it's probably a mixed experience. At the same time, I will add that a lot of the researchers that are working with English as a lingua franca, at least in my own experience, for instance, we have been brought up with a kind of educational system and a kind of ELT that pushed us to sort of erase the diversity that we were producing, not always successfully, as you can probably tell from my own English. But at the same time, I realized that perhaps those researchers that are publishing now also to some extent are the product of a long academic journey where we have been pushed to homogenize. So you know, that might have an influence on that too. And perhaps when we see new generations that have been that have experienced a more ELF-informed and diversity-informed kind of education, we might see even more diversity reflected in the writing and the academic papers of researchers, not only in ELF, but in other fields as well. And I think the last point, and I'll see if Will wants to add anything. My last point is that it's quite interesting to check some papers by Professor Anna Mauranen, who has been looking at researchers in academic papers, or RELFA, or written ELFA, and she is able to identify, when you get to the linguistic analysis, she is able to identify variability in the publications of researchers as well. So sometimes it may escape our initial reading, but a close linguistic analysis reveals still quite a lot of diversity in written academic papers. So if you're interested in this area, I recommend you, maybe you have already checked it, but if not, do check this work, because I think that despite coming from a training that pushes homogenization, diversity keeps coming through. Yeah. So I don't know if that was a useful answer to you.
It was very, very useful. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from that answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Moises.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to just quickly add, I mean, I think Sonia gave a very full answer there, and a very good answer that I think addressed the issue. So I just wanted to add a few things from my own personal experience. So I'm one of the editors of the book series, Developments in English as a Lingua Franca, and we have an explicit policy there that when people are writing the proposal and when they're writing their manuscript, they do not need to have their writing checked by a native speaker. And that's a policy you can see on the website. And when we send you out the documentation for the proposal, we make that very clear. Now, I realize this is only one book series in the literally hundreds that there are within ELT and applied linguistics, but it is at least a start. And I think you will find that there are more and more editors and book series that are moving in that direction. And I'd also say from an educational perspective, certainly at the University of Southampton, at the master's level and at the PhD level, again, we have an explicit policy that we do not mark students' work in reference to native speaker norms of communication. So when they write, if there's comments about language, it will be to do with intelligibility, as Sonia said. So that's literally where you read something and you can't follow what the student is trying to communicate. But at no point do we mark someone down because they don't use perhaps tense or articles in a British English way or an American English way, or we don't mark them down if they use an idiom that's not, you know, that wouldn't be a British English idiom or something like that. And that's explicitly part of the marking criteria. So I think things are changing, and it takes, of course, it takes decades for these changes to come through. But I hope anyway that what we're doing is part of a kind of a starting of the process.
Thank you. If no other hand is up, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, Moises. No problem.
So, up to what point would you accept flaws, such as not using the third person S, for example, that do not affect intelligibility, but are very deeply ingrained into all of us as unacceptable mistakes? Up to what point would you accept a mistake of that nature in one of your publications?
I think we would never call it a flaw or a mistake to
Oh,
begin
that's great
with.
to hear. So I've been pushing against it with my own students, and they're scandalized every time I say that it's perfectly okay not to write that S. And they're frankly quite scandalized, and it's shocking to them that I even say that, you know, me, a professor.
Yes, I understand. Again, it's probably a lot of emphasis on that third person S that comes through, at least in some countries, primary and secondary education. So when they get to university and we start telling them, actually, you don't need to produce it, there's, of course, a lot of shock. Yeah. But yes, I certainly have read, for instance, very recently a PhD thesis produced at the University of Southampton, and there were many occasions in which the PhD student didn't mark the third person S in writing. And of course, even though my mind might have picked it up, for me, that wasn't a mistake and it wasn't something to comment on. And it definitely wasn't a correction for the student to go back and do any of that in the PhD thesis writing. So, but I understand what you mean, and I understand sometimes there's a lot of resistance to suddenly such a change of position coming from your teachers. And what works for me in those cases is going back to the history of how endings used to work in English language, and how every person used to have an ending, and the third person S seems to be the only one remaining while the other disappeared. And that gets students reflecting and thinking, oh, okay. So
actually have them compare Spanish in this case with the conjugations of aiga and aja. That, you know, have both been present in the history of Spanish for hundreds of years, and only one of them is prestigious, but the other one has always been there too.
Yes.
And again, you know, some of them do change their minds about it, but others remain staunch prescriptivists.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Yes, I understand. It's funny you mentioned aiga, because I think we were just talking about aiga very recently with the research team here, and my own mother produces this form, and before I was aware of ELF research, I used to engage with her and correct her and give her a prescriptivist response, but now obviously I never do that anymore, and I appreciate the use for what it is.
I think it's a threshold concept, so to speak, to make that transition.
Yeah, and I guess that's a positive and interesting thing about what we argue in ELF research. I would say it applies to, obviously, how we speak many other languages. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Moises. Thank you, Sonia and Will, for your answers. Yeah, it's, as you said, it's not an easy change. It's not quick. We need time, but we also, I guess, just from listening to your presentation and Moises' questions, it's also a matter of looking at our own beliefs about language, what we think is language, what we use, how, what we teach as language. If we are we look only at the prescription side, or we look at the social language as a social practice. Is, I guess, it's a time to reflect how we look at language, what we understand as language, what we take to the classroom, right? The microphone is open. Please don't be shy. It's a time to exchange ideas, and please, nothing is right or wrong. This is a space to share. Yes, Graciela?
Thank you very much, Gloria, and thank you for the talk, Sonia and Will. It's a topic very interesting, but I have a question. It's not so clear to me what is the purpose of the research, whether it is to change the way of thinking of us about English, or it's not very clear to me. Are you trying to contribute to the way how we perceive or how we define English as, or let's say, good English? It's not clear to me yet. Could you tell me a little bit more about that, please?
Okay, yes. So I think we're not talking about the specific project we're doing at the moment, but rather the general idea of what decoloniality can add to our understanding of language and how we might research and teach language. So I don't think it's a case of trying to change anyone's opinion so much as to get people to engage with some of the things that we're engaging with and to hear what people's perspectives are. So what does English mean to you? How do you understand English? And when we talk about teaching, maybe some of the implications for how we teach English to our students, because I think sometimes, and certainly this would apply to me, particularly in the past, we perhaps teach language quite uncritically. So we reproduce some things that we may not believe ourselves, but we unconsciously reproduce some of the colonial ideologies. And I think a lot of that comes from how we perceive language, as Sonia was saying when she was talking about the example of the variation in her mother's use of Spanish. That, you know, in school we're brought up with this idea of there is a correct way to use a language and other forms of language are marginalized, and typically we don't question that. And then as teachers, that's often not part of our teacher education, and certainly it wasn't part of my teacher education. So I think it's introducing these ideas so that both researchers and teachers can reflect on their own practices and how they may want to reevaluate how they approach language, and then in turn how they teach language to their students.
Oh,
Does
okay.
that answer your question?
Yeah, because I was thinking of the question that you asked in one of the slides at the end of your talk, and it says, how do you conceptualize decolonizing English, I think, or it was like that, the question?
Yes. How do you conceptualize decolonization? Or how do you, when you think about decolonization and English, do you see English as a colonial language? Or do you see English as resources that we can appropriate, transform, decolonize?
Okay. Yeah, it's clear now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I guess in a way, the kind of questions we posed in the slide for you to discuss are in a way also what we are interested in finding out in the project we're doing. So not to transform our participants' ideas, but to find out how they think about English and why at this stage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graciela. Now we have Maestro Tito, and then we have Maestra Orquídea. Please say your name and when you from where you are connecting, please.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm Maestro Tito Antonio Mata from the Universidad Veracruzana. Yes, I wanted to say that I am really excited about this because this is a new area for me, and it's actually challenging some of my ideas about English, and I completely agree that the English is not. Coloniality is not in the language. It's not in English. Is somewhere else. Is where all the values, the cultural practices that can be conveyed through the use of the language. And yes, I completely agree with that. We need to address different things. The use of terminology, for example, the concept of native speaker. What is a native speaker, for example? Those things, and also our evaluative practices. I'm concerned also a little bit too about how we evaluate our students using our ways of evaluating, looking at the language and looking at the model of native speakerism, for example. And my question is also about the impact this new or this perspective has on certification processes. For example, the examinations like TOEFL, IELTS, etc., all those things. What impact can this view have on those kinds of certification that are being required by many institutions? It's a little bit of my concern regarding the evaluation and the concept of native speaker and English as a multilingual franca, which is a very, very interesting concept for me and a new concept for me. Thank you for for sharing these ideas and concepts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tito, for sharing your thoughts and your concerns and your questions. I think I would very much agree with you about the relevance of looking at international certifications, because as Will was saying, perhaps in our own programs and when we are teachers at university level, we can transform the evaluative criteria that we use relatively easily. But for instance, when you are a teacher perhaps at another level and you depend on the students passing an exam that you don't get to design, that someone else designs, and if you are aware that they are following Anglophone norms to decide what is correct or incorrect, acceptable or not acceptable, that is quite challenging for a teacher to be able to embed a more diversity-oriented approach in their teaching when they know the students will be examined according to very rigid evaluative criteria. So there are a lot of researchers currently looking at what some people call ELF-aware pedagogy. I think Will is probably going to talk about this a bit more later. And ELF researchers have also been denouncing the big test companies like IELTS, like TOEFL, because their tests are usually informed only by native speaking standards. To this date, this is an area that hasn't been developed very much in terms of how could we transform this. Some ideas have been put out there around whether in some universities we might be able to come up with alternative ways of assessing students and assessing whether students are ready to join up programs in English or not. But another line of inquiry is whether we can work with these big test companies to get them to think about how they could design the tests differently to orient more to intelligibility rather than to native speaker ideology or native speakerness. So it's an area to still develop. I don't know if Will would like to add a little bit more or, yeah, unmute.
So yeah, I mean, just to agree, that's an excellent question. And I think, as Sonia said, it's an area that's still very new in research. But I will, in a bit, when I talk about ELT and implications for ELT, we can come back to this topic. But it's something that definitely needs more work, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer.
Okay, I think we can have time for maybe two participations on the area of decolonization, because Dr. Will Baker, he will precisely talk about implications for ELT in some other areas. So if your questions, Maestra Orquídea, Maestro Javier, Maestro Antonio, Maestro Moises, and Griselda are related more to teaching implication, maybe we could wait for Dr. Will Baker. But Maestra Magdalena Escobar, she has a point. Can you read it in the chat? Because she's talking about coloniality. She said another colonizing element is the Eurocentric focus that ELT C-levels have, and we can find it in the methodologies, textbooks for ELT. I mean, she's got a very good point and a right point, actually, right? I don't know if you would like to comment on that, Sonia, and which it's about coloniality in the methodologies.
Yes, I think obviously this is not necessarily the area of expertise, but I agree that there has also, that's part of native speaker ism or native speaker ideology as studied in ELT, also has to do with this idea that sort of Anglophone contexts or the West, whatever that might be, also has the best methodologies for language teaching or for English language teaching. And work on native speakerism, I think, also very much aligns with efforts to decolonize ideas around methodology and what is the best methodology to teach a language that tries to impose choices and materials without considering context and the dynamics of changing contexts across the different classrooms. So of course, I completely agree. And I think there are some ELF researchers that actually do look more closely at, for instance, the design of materials. And yeah, it's another area that definitely needs attention and commitment. Yeah.
Okay, and then we can have our final question from Maestra Griselda, and then we can go to the next session with Dr. Wilbecker. Yes, Maestra Griselda, please.
Hi. Well, it's not a question; it's a comment, because I happened to read the project somewhere. I don't know why. Well, I'm a teacher at the University of Quintana Roo, so I know a little bit about this project because I happened to read it somewhere. Don't remember right now where. And what I wanted to comment is, or ask, if you are thinking about doing the project in other countries apart from Mexico. For example, Belize. I'm now on a sabbatical year here in Belize, and I just met two teachers from college, and we were talking about publishing, and they mentioned that they have been having problems to publish. And even though they didn't elaborate that much on the problems, I kind of realized that wording, writing was the problem. So now that I'm listening to you, I was wondering if you were planning to include a country like Belize, in this project, because that would be very interesting. Well, I think it's that would be a good idea. So it's just not a, well, yes, it's a question. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Griselda, well, thank you for your question. So at the moment, the project has the 5 settings that we've already got. So we obviously can't add any more at this stage, but certainly, I mean, we'd very much like to do a follow-up project. And from what you've just described, Belize, which sounds like it would be a very interesting setting. I think you also had another question or comment about publishing. And yes, I mean, as came up earlier, publishing is definitely an issue for a lot of people because they're expected to write in a particular way, which doesn't recognize that there are different ways of writing academic articles. And of course, it's not just about language as well. It's also about how people approach writing, rhetorical structures, also the access people have to different kinds of resources. So I can appreciate it. It's very difficult if you're from the global south to publish. I mean, it's well documented that most publications come from the global north. And even if the scholars are not originally from the global north, they're often in institutions in the global north because they have access to resources that enable you to publish into research that is not so easily, well, it's not so much there in the global south. So it's a big issue that needs addressing, yes.
Thank you. So now it's time for Dr. Wilbecker. So as I said, he's the director of the Center for Global Englishes in the University of Southampton.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I think it's everybody's afternoon. And just to say thank you again for the invitation to speak here and for everyone for joining. I'm just going to attempt to share my slides now. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
All right, so good. So what I'm going to do is talk about, as we said, I'm going to talk about some of the implications of decolonializing English and English language teaching. And in particular, I'm going to focus on intercultural and transcultural approaches. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the kind of wider areas of decolonializing in terms of ELT, but then focus specifically on the intercultural and transcultural dimensions. So hopefully what I'll be able to do is kind of link some of the theoretical ideas that Sonia talked about in the first half of the presentation and then that came up in our discussion, and look at some of the ways that they may or may not be relevant to English language teaching. And of course, there'll be plenty of time at the end to discuss some of your ideas, and we'd very much value your thoughts on this. Lots of this is still work in progress and things that we're working through ourselves. So we're very open to other ideas, comments and suggestions. So I'll talk a little bit about how traditional ELT is viewed and how that links in with colonial ideologies, and then look at alternative perspectives that we might draw on for English language teaching. So as we've talked about already, English is a multilingua franca, also the idea of intercultural and transcultural communication, and then different kinds of diversity in language teaching, which often intersect with intercultural communication or intercultural identities and multilingualism. And then lastly, the idea of intercultural and global citizenship, as I think this kind of draws on lots of these ideas and brings them together. Then I'll specifically go on to some alternative approaches to English language teaching and focusing on transcultural English language teaching as one possible approach, and look at some of the pedagogic implications of that. So to start with traditional English language teaching, I think it's fair to say that colonial ideologies are quite deeply embedded within traditional English language teaching, and I'm certainly not the first person to come up with or to put that forward. This is an idea that's been out there, as somebody was talking about with Robert Phillipson, but writers like Suresh Ganagaraja have been looking at issues like this for decades now. But in particular, it comes out through things such as came up in the questions, national scale standard language ideologies, which associate national language varieties with a particular nation. So the idea that we're teaching British or American English, and often the idea that we're testing that as well. Yeah, and this very much kind of links in with, even though, well, it links in with how the previous colonizers are still asserting an influence on English, and that these Anglophone centres are still the centre of English. And this also applies to national cultural characterizations as well. So the comment we had in the text about the cultural content of textbooks is still very Eurocentric, and even more, I would say, Anglo-centric as well. And of course, we have the native English speaker as the model. So again, we have this kind of Anglophone model, which all students are supposed to aim for. And that model entails things such as communicative competence, which typically focus on the linguistic and grammatical competence of a monolingual native English speaker. So very different to how most people actually use English. And also in what they focus on is very restrictive. So there's a focus on linguistic products such as grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation. Yeah, and I'll talk in a bit more detail later about why that's a very narrow way to view communication, and a very narrow view of how we should teach communication. And then again, as came up in the discussion, the idea that there's kind of, again, endonormative Anglophone methodologies and approaches to teaching. And I am aware of the irony of me as a native speaker of English and from an Anglophone institution talking about possible pedagogic approaches. So I would make it clear that what I'm talking about here are ideas for discussions. They're not trying to impose a new methodology or suggest there's a particular way you should go about teaching your classes. So in what way are these colonial? So I think I've talked about some of these already, but just to kind of summarize. So all of these aspects of traditional English language teaching, I would argue, have the potential to disempower English learners and teachers. I'm sorry, I'm just going to do what Sonia didn't minimize that. And users outside of the Anglophone world. So as Sonia talked about when she told us about English as a multilingua franca, it typically takes place in settings that are both multilingual and multicultural, and English is used for intercultural communication. And this is very different from the kind of native speaker Anglophone models, and so potentially disempowers most users of English. And further, the model of communication and language with the aims of native-like competence, I think, as we're all very familiar with, are unrealistic and unachievable for most people, because to become a native speaker of English, you literally have to become a native speaker. You have to have grown up in the culture, you have to go through a whole process that most people would be quite rightly be unwilling, and also it's unrealistic for them. And most importantly, it's irrelevant. There's no relevance to speaking like a native speaker of English when you're using a language for intercultural communication. So I would argue, along with many other people, that this can be viewed as a form of colonialism, due particularly to the prestige and power that's often associated with the Anglophone centre, and hence any other kind of English is seen as somehow inferior or error English or simplified English, and hence then the users themselves are also put in a lower position, which is very problematic, I think, for education. I'm sure we're all in agreement there. So some of the alternative perspectives that I think we can draw on in English language teaching. So first of all, as Sonia's been talking about, English as a lingua franca. So I think it's worth repeating these definitions, because the crucial thing is that English as a lingua franca is a functional use of English. It's not a variety of English. So as the definition from Barbara Seidelhofer shows, it's any use of English among speakers of different first languages. And then as Jennifer Jenkins has also highlighted, it's a multilingual franca. Yep, so English is embedded within multilingualism. So what we're looking at, first of all, is multilingual communication. And then, as Jennifer Jenkins writes, in which English is available as contact language of choice, but is not necessarily even chosen. Yep, so it's there, but it's actually the multilingualism that's the first element. And this has some important implications. So while native speakers of English are included, yeah, and it's very important that they are included, but I won't talk about that in detail now. But just to say briefly that, of course, if we exclude native speakers, then again, we're kind of putting them as separate to everybody else. But the crucial point is that native speakers are not the linguistic reference norm in lingua franca communication. Yet native speakers of English use it as a lingua franca, or need to use it as a lingua franca, the same way that everybody else does. So this means that there's a decentering of Anglophone norms in communication. Yep, so Anglophones no longer provide the norms of communication through English as a lingua franca. And then to repeat again, as I think we've, both Sonia and myself have said at various points, English as a lingua franca is not a variety of English. So it's an alternative way of seeing English. And this has some, I think, really quite profound implications for how we approach language and communication, and how we then go about teaching it. Okay, so I think this also links to an idea that I've been working on over the last kind of 10 years or so, which is transcultural communication. So before I talk about the links between that and English as a lingua franca, I thought it'd probably be helpful just to very briefly define transcultural communication, because I know it's quite a new idea that perhaps not everyone is familiar with. So transcultural communication has really come about as a response to lots of the research that I've been doing, and my colleagues have been doing as well, where we look at intercultural communication through English as a lingua franca. And I've come to the conclusion that intercultural doesn't quite capture, or doesn't really adequately explain a lot of what we saw in the very multilingual and multicultural communications that we were observing. So transcultural communication can be defined as communication where interactants move through and across rather than in between cultural and linguistic boundaries. So named categories of language such as British English or Mexican Spanish or Spanish Spanish, yep, can no longer be taken for granted, because the borders between different languages become blurred, and also importantly they become transgressed and transcended, yet whether that's done consciously or unconsciously. So what we often see in transcultural communication is multiple scales or levels that are simultaneously present. So in terms of cultural references, we may see national cultures as one of the scales, but we may also see local cultures, more global cultures, also different temporal scales and different speeds of or different time frames of the references, from transient interactions to more long-term kind of historical processes and influences. And we see all of that simultaneously present. So that's the important thing there, is these, we don't see these things separated out nice and neatly, rather they're all in the interaction together, and participants draw on all these different things simultaneously or at the same time. So I think this links very well with English as a lingua franca and the kind of approach that we follow there. So communication is not just seen as something about language, but it's more about how meaning is created and interpreted. So if we're interested in how meaning is created, which I think if we're interested in communication, we should be, then what we're looking at is culture. But we're not looking at culture from the perspective of national cultures, but rather from a kind of intercultural and transcultural perspective. And then we need to look at these things in an integrative manner. So the idea of mode, which again, I won't talk about in detail, but we can come back to into the discussion. Yep, so the different modes that people use for communication. So English as a lingua franca and English as a multilingua franca positions English as embedded in these wider multilingual, multicultural and multimodal resources. And then these are effectuated through processes of translanguaging, which I'm guessing some of you are familiar with already, but again, we can discuss this in more detail later, and transcultural and transmodal processes. And all of these come together to make communication. And I should also emphasize that this is not something new or exotic, although the terminology is new and the ideas, the terminologies and perhaps the concepts as they're explained are new. The actual processes of transcultural communication and translanguaging and English as a multilingua franca are not new processes at all. They're very long processes that have occurred in multilingual scenarios, and they're also very much everyday processes. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to kind of go through some of the examples, but you'll see lots of the research that I draw on looks at very kind of mundane everyday interactions. So it's not something exotic or strange. It's something that all of us do every day. Okay, so it's important to point out that alongside this linguistic and cultural diversity, there are often there are a whole range of other diversities and identities that are important to understanding communication and interaction. So again, I don't have time to talk about these in detail today, but they include things such as gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, class, and morality. Yeah, and there are many researchers looking at that and the implications for ELT. So I think a concept within education that brings or draws on all of these different ideas and brings them together quite well, I think, is the idea of intercultural and global citizenship education in particular. So for those not familiar with the idea, global citizenship is the extension of citizenship beyond national borders. So it recognizes that many of our social relations are global, and that we need to respect and value diversity, and that many of us participate and are responsible to communities at multiple levels. So of course we're responsible to our local communities, but what we do locally also has national implications and also has global implications. Yep, so much of what we do is both locally and globally relevant. So it's this idea that citizenship extends beyond the local and the national to the global as well. And within education, this means that we should facilitate intercultural learning experiences, and we should facilitate and encourage engagement with others. And this needs to lead to change in both the individuals, so both our students' behavior and their perceptions, as well as students' behavior and perceptions towards others, and of course ourselves as teachers. So what does this mean for actually teaching, for English language teaching itself? Now, there are many different things that this means for English language teaching itself, and obviously I won't be able to go through all of them today. So I'm just going to focus on one particular approach that I've been working on with a colleague of mine called transcultural ELT. So I've got this table here, and you can see from the table there's the aspects of traditional ELT that we talked about in the first slide that I showed you. And then transcultural ELT is a kind of alternative to this that draws together some of the different perspectives that I've been talking about. So in transcultural ELT, we take a critical approach to language and culture and identity. We challenge established discourses of these different categories, and we recognize in English language teaching that English has a global role as a multilingua franca for transcultural communication across and through borders. So things like communicative competence are replaced with ideas such as intercultural communicative competence and intercultural awareness. And the idea is to foster a positive attitude to diversity, difference and others, and also to equip students with the skills and knowledge to successfully engage in intercultural and transcultural communication. So the model of the native speaker is replaced with models of the intercultural speaker and intercultural and global citizens. So within our teaching, as I said before, we move beyond communication seen in terms of linguistic products and widen it out to the different kind of modes that people use in communication. So it's a focus on processes of communication and adaptable uses of communicative resources. So of course, in English language teaching, this will include English, but it's English as a multilingua franca. So not just English by itself, but also other languages in students' repertoires, but also other modes that students may use in communication. So the kind of visual symbols they use if people are communicating online. And of course, we have lots of images, videos, those gifts, etc., that we use. And then in terms of teaching methodologies, there is no one particular methodology, but rather it means teaching that's adapted and based on local contexts, cultures, and needs. Yeah, and a move away from a reliance on Anglophone methodologies and approaches. So in terms of kind of what this might mean in classrooms, it means moving beyond just awareness raising, although of course that's still very important, but also it should involve changes in the learner. So if we remember back to the intercultural citizenship education, an important step of it is it's both raising awareness, but then translating that into actual change in the learner. And this change then in turn results in actions through learners' engagement with a diverse range of communities across both cultural and linguistic boundaries. And there are many activities that we can include to do this. Yeah, some very easy to do, some perhaps need a bit more organisation, but I think we're probably very familiar with lots of them. So things like critically exploring cultural and linguistic images and discourses in the materials that we use in classes, but also in media that students have access to and in local communities. And this links as well with exploring the complexity of our own cultures and languages. Yeah, in many of the most supposed, or in many classes that are supposedly monolingual and monocultural, when we start to explore it, we often find a huge diversity and a lot of complexity there. And when students are aware of this, then they can then kind of generalize from this, that if there's this much complexity in their own environment, then it's likely to be just as complex in other people's environments. And then, of course, when the opportunity is there, engaging in interactions with those who would be defined as cultural others in one way or another. So we can do this, of course, both virtually and in person as well. Yeah, and there's decades worth of research on study abroad and virtual exchanges and teletandem, etc. Now, it's important to point out, as I said right at the beginning, that this is not one particular methodology, and there's never going to be a single methodology that's relevant or appropriate in all settings. And even the labels that I've used, such as traditional and transcultural, are of course generalizations and stereotypes in themselves. So teachers can draw from different approaches and decide which particular elements of each approach suit their particular context. And I would argue that the two should be seen as on a continuum. There's not a clear distinction between one or the other. So teachers can make incremental changes towards one or the, well, hopefully towards a more transcultural approach, but there's no kind of I realize that the transcultural approach or all the different elements of it won't necessarily be relevant to all contexts. And also it takes time to change and change direction. So as always, research may inform and inspire teachers, but the details on how to incorporate aspects of a transcultural approach are best decided in local settings based on the needs and interests of teachers and students and other stakeholders. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, this is very much still a work in progress and a lot more research in these areas are needed. But as I've also said, other researchers have been engaging in similar and related topics for many decades now. And some of the areas that I think are particularly relevant are the idea of intercultural and transcultural awareness, intercultural citizenship education, English as a lingua franca awareness and the related idea of English as a multilingual franca awareness, globally orientated ELT approaches such as global English language teaching, and then incorporating diversity or a range of diversities into ELT such as gender, sexuality, interculturality, class, etc. Yeah, and as I said, if you're interested in that, we can talk about that in more detail later, and there are many other researchers working in this area. So overall, I think transcultural ELT is pursuing good language teaching practice in general. It's not a revolution in ELT, rather it's an evolution of many processes that are already underway. So in conclusion, we can say English as a lingua franca and transcultural communication open up new directions in how we think about research and teach the English language and culture and communication related to that in a manner that I think avoids some of the methodological nationalism and colonialism that I think is still very much deeply embedded within English language teaching pedagogy and how we think about English within the field. Yeah, and just to quickly summarize some of the ways that we can do that. So rather than a revolution, I think it's an extension of current good practice. Yeah, and it involves critical approaches to language and culture, resisting Anglophone colonial orientations, focusing on processes of language rather than the products and fixed forms, emphasizing local contexts and cultures, development of intercultural and transcultural awareness, yeah, and awareness of multilingualism and English as part of multilingualism, incorporating other diversities such as gender and sexuality, and then having the global intercultural citizen as the model or aim rather than the Anglophone native speaker. Yeah, and as I said before, teachers may choose to adopt or adapt different elements of it, sorry, excuse me, as appropriate to circumstances. Okay, so that's me finished with the presentation, but what I thought might be helpful was to suggest some questions that we could think about. And these are some of the ideas that for me are kind of core questions when I think about transcultural ELT and when I think about decolonizing English language teaching. But of course, as Sonia said at the end of her presentation, if you have other questions or comments, etc., we'd be very interested to hear those. But just to go through the questions very quickly, the first question, and perhaps the more controversial or provoking question, is: do you agree that English language teaching promotes colonial language ideologies? So in other words, if we do not deal with these issues in the classroom, is our teaching part of the problem? Yeah, if we just teach according to Anglophone models, are we actually promoting colonial ideologies? And how relevant do you think some of the ideas and concepts brought up here are? So things like English as a lingua franca, transcultural communication, global citizenship, and incorporating a range of different diversities into the classroom. Okay, so I will finish the presentation there, and I'll look forward to discussing this further with everyone.
Okay, thank you, Will, for your presentation. And now we are going through the questions or any comments related to the questions that Will have already explained to you, and in general about the intercultural, transcultural, the new proposal about the teaching, the alternative teaching in the about transcultural. Sorry, with the mosquito here. Sorry. You are welcome with your comments or questions. And we have a hand here that is Patricia. Would you please just tell your name and where you are from, which university are you from, and then your comment or question, please?
Hi, hello. Yes, I'm Patricia Núñez from the Universidad Veracruzana. And well, the more I hear it, like more questions I have or doubts about how it thinks. On the one hand, I actually my whole doctoral work was about I don't know, giving voice in a way to students in their writing for their dissertations. Okay, where we feel they are forced to write in a native, not only a native speaker form, or well, trying to imitate native speakers, but also all this academic English writing, and give room for them to show who they are, because as we write, that's what we do, right? We're showing who we are and all of the background we have, and this background can be very varied. And I was like kind of fighting for this, right? Like we should allow students, right, like to be who they are, not only when speaking, but also when writing, and when writing their dissertations, the very same dissertations. But on the other hand, then, well, when I heard Moises asking about this S thing, I was like, oh my God, but I've been insisting on my basic English students this very semester that they should add an S for the third person singular. And every time they make that mistake, because I say it's a mistake, right, I tell them, right, remember, you should add it, etc., etc. And so I'm not so sure then when something should be a mistake and something is then just, I don't know, it's just, we're not being intelligible, for example, I mean, what's the difference there, right? I mean, and then how can we actually go for these in the language classrooms themselves, right? Because we're so used to all of this, and that's where the way we learned, and that's the way we're teaching now. But all of these other possibilities there, and world is changing, but well, it is changing slowly, of course. So what is exactly what we should do, or what we should tell our students to do as well? I mean, it's, I don't know. My mind was blowing. So, well, basically, I guess my question is, what's the difference between, I mean, you said, for example, there are certain mistakes that are not seen as mistakes, which are, or this intelligibility, where does it start? Yes, and where those mistakes fade away, but then which ones are actually the ones that count for intelligibility, or I don't know, something like that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your question, Patricia, and it's good to know that you've been blown away by some of the ideas. It's always a very gratifying response. Yeah, I think that a lot of what we're trying to do in this project, as you said, is to get people to critically engage, and for ourselves as well, to critically engage in many of the concepts that are kind of taken for granted in both language teaching and language research. So the exact idea is to get people to really start to reevaluate what they do. And yeah, the question of errors is a very difficult one. And I think it's not easy to decide what's an error and what's not. I mean, it's a question that can only be decided, I think, within context. So something like the third person singular, of course, I mean, we need to be quite careful, because on the one hand, it typically makes no difference to intelligibility. It's an irrelevance for most communication. But on the other hand, if students have to pass an exam, then they do need to know about that for that particular exam. So I think you brought up a really important point, and we need to teach and think about language in context. So there are times when teaching third person singular is going to be really important, because we know it's going to be in the exam, and if we don't do it, we're not helping our students. And there'll be other times where, you know, if the student wants to communicate with, I don't know, maybe the student wants to engage in online discussion forums or something like that, wants to engage in social media, then it would be completely irrelevant. So I think the thing to do is the important point is to get in classrooms for teachers and students to critically look at the way that they use language, and to be aware of diversity and variability, so that I can use language in this way, in this setting, I can use it this way in another setting, but also not to be afraid to challenge that as well. So, you know, if you're in social media and you post something that doesn't have a third person singular, if some kind of, I don't know, if a native speaker attempts to correct you, then to point out to the native speaker that actually there's a lot more ways of using English than British or American English. And, you know, so there are times when they can challenge it. But then, of course, if you do that with a TOEFL examiner, that will get you in trouble. So again, it's really important to look at language in context, to come back to that point. So I hope that answers a little bit. I know your question was a very big question, but I hope that answers a little bit.
Yes, it eases my mind a little bit as well. So, yeah,
I don't know if Sonia wanted to add anything there.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. And we have another hand here. It's Hakim. Is that okay? How will I pronounce it? Hakim or Hakim?
Hakim is
okay. Hakim.
Is good.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for this presentation. I'm sorry I got a bit late, but I could I mean, understand the most of the presentation, and actually it was very important for me to be here because my research, the research I'm leading right now for my master, is about English as a lingua franca. I have some, well, I would say that well, I understand pretty well what it is all about, but when I led my investigation and I asked my participants that are teachers and student teachers about the topic, I mean, English as a lingua franca and its implication in Mexico, most of them would say that there is a lack of context here in Mexico. I mean, the language we speak, that is Spanish, is already a lingua franca. A lot of people, I mean, even in the region, in other countries in Latin America speak Spanish, and even in the United States, a lot of people speak Spanish too. So they were like kind of saying that that there is a lack of context. Obviously, they also realize that we have internet, we can communicate through the internet. I mean, and it's easier in English. But what do you think? Well, even for transcultural communication in general, they would say the same. There is a lack of context. We feel that we are all from the same culture some way, and if we speak Spanish, it's all going to be, you know, we don't really have so many troubles, you know. So what would be maybe a good argument to consider, I mean, transcultural communication in a context like the Mexican one?
Okay, yes. So thank you for your question, Hakim. So I think that one of the best ways of starting, one of the easiest ways to start is to look at the complexity in the language classroom that you're involved in. So to ask students about their background, to ask them about their family background. And what you almost always discover is that it's not so simple. Even if, you know, they say, oh, we all speak Spanish, we all share a similar Latin culture, etc. When you start asking people, of course, you'll discover that there are many other languages that people speak in the classroom as well, and that people come from a range of different backgrounds, they come from a range of different ethnicities, and there's a huge amount of diversity there. And then that kind of opens students up to the idea that, okay, it's not so simple as, you know, the simple, I belong to this nation, and hence I speak this language, and we share the same culture. And then that, I think, opens the way to looking at other cultures from a similar perspective. So I don't know if Sonia wants to add a bit there, particularly in reference to Spanish.
Yeah, very interesting. And thank you, Hakim, for your question and for sharing your insights from your findings from your dissertation. And it's great to hear that you have been engaging with ELT literature as well. Very happy. We're very happy to hear that. I find it very interesting that you're talking about Spanish as a lingua franca. I did some research with checking and exploring conceptualizations of English in Spanish-speaking settings. And one of the elements I was looking at is how they talk about Spanish too. And to what extent, okay, they reinforce them as separate languages, or to what extent they might blur the boundaries between what's English and Spanish. With some of that came up in the data. But what was particularly interesting for me is that many students showed awareness of diversity within Spanish. So how different people speak Spanish in different ways across Latin America, even the USA, Spain, and some of them also showed awareness of you know, uses that go beyond national varieties, beyond Mexican English or Spanish, Mexican Spanish or Spanish. And this awareness, this experience that they have developed through their own everyday encounters with different Spanish speakers also help them in many cases make sense of diversity in English use. So that's potentially another interesting source of elicitation for a classroom as well. And maybe their experiences with Spanish as a lingua franca can be useful to think about English as a multilingua franca too.
Thank you very much for your answer. Yeah, that's pretty much what I had in thought. Maybe not all teachers in Mexico think about it or compare. I mean, the situation we have with Spanish and obviously what we understand is the case of English that is spoken everywhere in the world, not only in English-speaking countries. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Oops. Thank you, Hakim, and Will and Sonia for your question and answers. And there are also there is a person that is trying to raise her hand and she couldn't. This is Magdalena. And then after Magdalena, we're going to back to the hands with Moises and Javier. So please.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon here in Mexico. Thank you so much for your presentation. I've been waiting for this for a long time, and I'll tell you why in a while. I'm in Chiapas, Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas, which is in the southern of Mexico. Here, the state is a particular state and no different from others because we have an important presence of original cultures or native cultures and native languages as well. There are around 20 native languages alive, and there's a recent Mexican effort from Mexican government to promote the use and the continuity and the learning of these languages. So I've been running a project with my students, my TEFL students at the University of Chiapas, and they are teaching English to people who are in indigenous context. We call it that way. And I guess this is decolonizing ELT. Why is that? Because since it's been a year and we've had around 90, 100 students. They are based in different communities. We were teaching remotely, and we're still teaching remotely. And I had no idea what I was embarking myself on at the beginning. Even though I'm from Chiapas originally and I know my state, or I thought I knew my state at that time. So it's been a complete different journey. We're not using, I'm in charge of guiding these students who in a term or 2 terms will get their diploma as English language teachers. So I'm trying to guide them on how to do this, but there's no really, there's no manual. There's very literature, I guess. There's very still a work in progress, as Dr. Baker said. So we are teaching the students trying to integrating their native languages and using the words they know. There's even using photos. I'm taking photos myself with my cell phone and sending this as material for the classes. We're not using any book that has been published from any publishing house. It's a prestige in Mexico, and we are not taking materials from internet. So we are trying to make this as intercultural as possible for our students. So they relate to the image of a church or a school, a local school in their communities, and they talk about that, or they try to talk about that. Of course, this is a very, very basic level. They are false beginners, most of them, and it's been quite a journey and very rewarding to see how a person can approach because we give them a kind of diploma at the end just to motivate them when they finish their 30 hours workshops. And it's been very rewarding to see how a young child says thank you in Spanish and also in English, but also in Soltil or Setal, which are the native languages here. And so the question is there a way to train ourselves? Because I'm kind of doing this just by I don't know, by what I learned in my PhD, which unfortunately wasn't about this. But from what I know, from my experience, from my years as teacher and as professor at the university, but is there a way to train ourselves to do this, or are we being pioneers in intercultural approaches and in decolonizing ELT practices? So, or is it our job to document what we're doing here, and at the same time a duty to do it, because that can be useful to others? So that will be my 2 questions. And well, this is our experience. It's just an anecdote is one of the kids in their classes, she was around 9 years old, trying to learn family members in English and connecting this to their own native language. So as they didn't know exactly how to say it in their own language, but their parents speak this we call it original languages here, and their parents they're native speakers of the language, their grandparents, so they would go and grab their grandparents from the kitchen and sit the grandma next to her, so she could learn how to say family members or grandma in English, but also she was trying to integrate her background, her cultural background into the class. And that's pretty much the heart of the project. And it's been almost a year, but I'm still, I think I still need to know how to do this. I'm just doing this from previous knowledge, intuition, and that's it. So is there a way to train ourselves, or is there something else we can do to improve here and to replicate this into different, at a different level? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Magdalena. I mean, that project sounds amazing. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. So, I mean, my first question would be, are you going to publish or write something about this experience? Because I think that would be, as you said, how do we kind of take this forward? It would be to share the kind of the good practices and the, as you said, the pioneering projects that you do. So do you have plans to publish or write about it?
Very little time, but yes, I do have plans. I asked these students who were, they were former students, now they are about to complete their program, the undergraduate program in ELT. I asked them to keep a journal. So, and some of them are even running some interviews with participants. So once we have more information, we collect more data, I think it would be worth it to have some guidelines on how to structure this. It's been a completely a different journey. I actually moved myself to you know, Mexico is it's very big, and I live my hometown. It's 7 hours away from here. I moved here. I made my own photos. I collected, I went to different communities, and of course, this is not just Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas, Chiapas University. It's also in collaboration with, this is in Spanish, we call it Centro Estatal de Lenguas, Arte y Literatura Indígena, which is the Center of Languages, Native Languages, Art and Culture. And they are the ones who were interested in not just doing every single effort for keeping their languages, native languages alive in Chiapas, but also to kind of introduce this. So I've learned that this is about, they use the word, you know, native people here use the word respect, and it's been a very respectful way to interact with this kind of people, because they don't want to feel like English is kind of is taking something away from them, from their own culture and from their own background and their linguistic elements. So the idea was integrating everything, putting things together, and talking about their festivities, talking about not teaching them vocabulary they would probably not use as underground or something else, but using elements from their own culture. So yes, as soon as I have some time to sit and write, I will do it. But a guide would be more than welcome if possible. Thank you.
Okay, yes. I mean, I think, as you said yourself, that it is very pioneering, and it's certainly for me, it's very inspiring to hear of approaches like that to English language teaching, because the whole motivation for the project was, you know, this concern that English is often promoted as an empowering language, but in many ways it's not an empowering, you know, going through English language teaching experiences is not empowering. It can very easily be disempowering, but what you're describing sounds very empowering, and the kind of thing that certainly in this project we're hoping to find and look at good practice for. So I think, as you said, the thing to do would be to share it, because it is new. is to share it and see that are there other people doing similar things in other contexts, or can people learn from your experiences? I think that would be really important. So I don't know, Sonia, if you wanted to add anything.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just very quickly that, yes, perhaps you're feeling that you need training and you need support, and of course, engaging in dialogue. And there are some platforms, some online courses that deal with global Englishes that you might be able to engage with if you want. But I think here my point would be that it sounds like you have a lot to contribute yourself, so to this training process. So yes, definitely do something with that information. It sounds like you're really making English learning meaningful for these students, rather than making the task something that's very alien to them, right? Rather than teaching in ways that are alien to them. So yes, we'd like to hear much more about that. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Magdalena and Will and Sonia, for your comments. And we don't have, a lot of time. I mean, we have already run out of time, but I think we can extend some minutes. So I can see some comments on the chat, but also there are also some hands here. So maybe you would like to say your comments or questions in 2 minutes, please, so we can have others can share their ideas as well. Oh, I saw Moises first, but I don't see his hand anymore. So maybe Javier, would you like to go ahead, please?
Thank you very much. I'm from Jalapa, Veracruz, and I have a question related to the effect or possible changes in the structures that limit the use of English in everyday life. I have been doing research with teachers from 2 intercultural universities in Mexico, and I know how hard they struggle when trying to integrate a more critical, decolonized view of ELT, especially when they face social, political, economical, and academic structures that already determine their way of life, particularly for indigenous and rural communities. So the question would be, how would you say we can push changes through the institutions, syllabus, training programs, etc., that we work with from this perspective that can impact beyond our classroom? Because I have seen that there is a limitation there when we recognize the effect of integrating the decolonization theory. So what would you say about that? Thank you very much.
Okay, Javier, well, thank you for your question. And I think it's a very difficult one to answer. And I mean, I think from my own perspective, I wouldn't be comfortable saying how I think you should do it in your setting, because clearly, I have very little expertise in education and in the context that you're in. So I think it's really important that it's something that you have to decide yourself. But I'm guessing if you work in a university, typically, one good thing about universities is that while there is always central control, they're a lot more autonomous than perhaps secondary schools or primary schools, where the curriculum is very tightly controlled. So usually there are some spaces where you can introduce new ideas, where you can challenge dominant discourses. But how exactly you do that, I think, always has to be decided locally. The one thing you don't want to do, of course, is be reproducing colonial ideologies by importing methodologies from another place that suited the place where they were developed, but may be completely irrelevant and disempowering if they just imported without adaptation or change to another one. So I'm sorry, that's probably not a very satisfying answer for you. But I mean, I don't feel I have the expertise to be able to suggest ways that you can do that in your particular setting. So I don't know, Sonia, if you had.
Yes, I'll just be very brief in saying thank you so much, Javier, for your question. And it's great to see you and to be able to interact with you finally, other than email. Yes, okay, such an important question when there are tight structures, and Will was saying that some other levels of education might be even much more tightly controlled. And I agree 100% with his advice of avoiding taking solutions for all contexts and really examining solutions for your context. But at the same time, there's also research that looks at classroom practices and that looks at how teachers sometimes find critical moments where they are able to perform small challenges. Perhaps we were talking about the third person S before, where you might be able to negotiate a different position with your students and say, this is what you might need to do for the exam, but also understand that there's a different way of evaluating the omission of the third person. So there might be critical moments in classrooms where there can be some awareness raising that slowly but surely might bring about bigger changes eventually in the structures. Yeah, but of course, that's another area to continue researching and see how far agency can actually lead to structural change.
Okay. Thank you. Antonio, please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Antonio Iván Sánchez Huerta, and I am from the UV, from Universidad Veracruzana, as well as my colleagues here. Thank you very much for these presentations. They have been very interesting, really enlightening, because actually we see that language goes beyond culture. Language goes beyond constructs. Okay, and also, I mean, taking a look at languages, I mean, from an imposition view, I mean, that's also interesting. Okay, and most importantly, to make sure that students can at some point appropriate the language, but we have to be careful with certain things. So I consider this topic has many different implications. From EFL to ESL, and also teaching for specific purposes, such as academic purposes, which actually, well, some of my colleagues have already talked about. And I was just thinking, it's just that these different ways to teach English, and also these different things that we do in our classrooms, they come from different regulations, from different rules, from different styles, from different conventions. And I was just thinking about this thing of, for example, the DS, and also academic styles in terms of writing, and also things like punctuation, etc., and so forth. So my question in here is, will the colonization of the language represent breaking all the constructs that underlie these practices, or will it actually strengthen them? I mean, it would be really good to look at these two sides. I mean, in one hand, I mean, how can we break actually this thing? Because I mean, people usually think black and white in terms of this English comes from this place and it's adequate to talk or maybe to pronunciate it this way, or according to a writing style. I mean, you should avoid certain things, and you have to use a lot of hedging and careful with certain words. You have to show that you are humble, etc., etc. But at some point, I mean, it is difficult to sound like yourself when you are actually being imposed that you should not talk like that. That you have to be cautious, that you have to be careful with the way that you make comments, with the way that you do certain things. So I think this has a lot of implications which are really, really interesting, and I would like to see them from the strengthening point of view. Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Antonio, for this question and these reflections. Yes, I think it's quite challenging. I'm trying to think of the idea of styles, and especially we also do a lot of research in relation to English as a medium of instruction. where you have to perform expertise in a particular subject. So not just expertise as an English speaker, but you have to perform expertise as a biologist. And there can also be quite narrow monolithic models around how to do that, and how do you write an essay, and do you need to be humble, and you need to, or is being really assertive, discouraged, etc. These are all really important questions. They are probably some that we face and we have to deal with every day. It's probably quite difficult to also, we probably have to judge in a moment by moment basis, what are we challenging as well? Because sometimes I think, okay, why is the advice that you should be more hedging that language? Is that coming from a standard academic English, monolithic view of academic English, or is that an advice that has to do with good research practice? Because I have sometimes found myself telling students, okay, maybe you want to hedge your expression here, but it's not because I think that's a better way to express yourself in writing at all times, but maybe because in that specific sentence or expression, I think, well, we actually can't be that sure about that. So be careful about how generalizing your claim is, because this still needs more research. So that's quite difficult to de-entangle. When are we dealing with standardization and prescriptivist views about language? When are we also dealing with some advice that might be useful for being a good communicator in a very specific context? So I guess I don't have a definitive answer other than that this is probably something to unpick and analyze from moment to moment, and realize that we probably cannot resist and deconstruct absolutely everything at the same time, but we have to see what's relevant and what's particularly oppressive, perhaps in a particular moment. I don't know if that's very helpful to you, though.
And to be honest, I was not precisely waiting for a yes/no answer or something like that, or like a solution. But actually, I mean, to be honest, this gives room to a very deep discussion, an exchange of ideas, which would be really, really enriching, not only for for people who are learning to speak the language, I mean, as foreigners, but also for native speakers. I mean, where do these regulations come from? Why do I have to express myself this way? Why do I have to follow certain rules and conventions and so forth? So it is really, really interesting. So I think the part which is really rich in here is to become aware of all these different aspects, okay? But not to precisely untangle all these different things, but to become aware. I think awareness is key at some point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonio, for your comment. And we still have some comments and kind of discussions in the chat with some of our participants. I only want to say something related to what Antonio, if you allow me. It's there are also studies in which they are finding out that native speakers of English also accommodate, or at least they are suggesting they need to accommodate as well to these kind of ELF groups when they are communicating. So as you mentioned, it's also an issue of awareness most of the time, but yes, we have to go in depth with studies about that as well. Okay, thank you. And Antonio, if you allow me, we can get just a couple of minutes so we can check very quickly the comments on the chat, as I don't see any other hands here. So sorry, but I don't know who is Aula 147. I think someone there in a university, she's mentioning another colonizing element is the Eurocentric focus on that ELT syllabus have. Antonio, well, Antonio was commenting here also. I consider this topic has many different implications, from teaching EFL, ESL to teaching English for academic courses such as publications and the different conventions, styles, rules, and regulations we try to teach come from different cultures, as well as writers with a lot of experience. Will decolonization represent breaking all the constructs that underlie these practices, or will it strengthen them? Well, which was his question and comment now. It would be interesting to analyze both sides. Thank you. Then we have some other comments. By the way, there is a list in which you can register your assistance so you can receive your document that you were assisting here. And then we have Tere is mentioning, I think that the starting point is learning from countries that have not been a colony. For example, China. Don't you think that we have to widen our perspective of different cultures other than the European ones? So that's a question for Will. We still have time if you would like to comment, Will.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Tere, for your question. Yes, I mean, I agree 100%. We need to widen our perspective beyond European countries. But I'd also say on top of widening our perspective beyond European countries, it's really important to go beyond national scales of cultures. So as I think we've talked about quite a lot over the last few hours, culture is not just about national cultures. You have local cultures, you have indigenous cultures, you have global cultures. And typically in communication, in many settings, all of these different cultures are present at the same time. So it's not just going beyond the kind of the focus on the US or the UK when we teach English. It's going beyond the idea that language is connected with a national culture, or that language itself is national. Of course, English as a lingua franca is nobody's first language, so it's not connected to any particular nation. And it's similar in terms of the cultures that we teach. It's introducing students to the idea that English can be used, as Magdalena described in her project, English can be used to connect people in local cultures, in indigenous cultures, at many different levels. So yes, I agree 100%. We need to widen our perspective, and not just at a national perspective, but at multiple different levels. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Will.
Thank you, Will. Yes, it answers my question. Sorry, I have my camera off because my internet is not quite well. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Tere. Okay, so continue with the chat. There is an interesting discussion here in the chat. So I will start reading it. Rosa, where Natalia Moncada was mentioning, I agree, it's all too Western guided. And then Moises was commenting, but aren't we a Western culture? I mean, mainstream Mexican culture, we're predominantly Christian, Western religion, and we speak Spanish, a Western imperial language. Of course, it's hard to call indigenous Mexican Western, but I think most Mexicans do not identify as indigenous. And then Carolina, well, I think there are no direct answer to what Moises was mentioning, but I think later on there are some comments related to what he said. And then we have Carolina mentioning, thank you for this interesting chat. It's an excellent opportunity to share and learn, and congratulations. And then we have Natalia, again, Natalia Moncada mentioning, we are to some extent, however, we as Mexicans are not seen as a big influential Western culture. And Javier, thanks, and thanks again. And then Moises comment, we are not a central country to be sure, but neither are some smaller European countries. So I think we need a different label for what we are trying to resist. I would also argue that our culture is pretty central to the subset of Western culture that is Latin American culture. Okay, oh yes, and Moises continue commenting, so perhaps we need a different label for what we are trying to resist, given that a lot of in us and a lot of us identify as Western, even it's our own variety of Western. And I can see that, I don't know if Moises would like to add something else, or if you would like to say something, Will and Sonia, about the comments. But because then Harkin was commenting through, but Western society also have cultures from all around the world. I'm myself French, but I am original from North Africa. I teach English, but I enjoy presenting other English varieties like from Nigeria, Singapore, or India. And it's also a question of choice when we look for materials, right? So another comment about Moises, then we have, perhaps class and power are better names for what we are trying to resist. I would say that I resist the impositions of rich English companies and universities that try to impose what English is and what good teaching is. But actually, some of those companies and institutions are not English, they are transnational. So yeah, that's what I resist, impositions of the rich and powerful from central countries. Then Javier comments, I agree, Moises, and maybe there is why there is a fundamental difference between decolonial and decolonization in America Latina. And Moises replies, that does not require me to give up my own Westernness, okay? So I think that's the end of that discussion, which is really rich, I think, and we appreciate you are doing that in the chat. And then Magdalena mentions, thanks very much to the organizer. Oh, this is thank you and congratulations for Dr. Baker and Dr. Moran for the interesting presentations. And then, okay, many thanks later. But I don't know if you would like to add something, because I apologize with Moises because I saw at the beginning his hand and then suddenly it disappeared and I continue with the other hands. Would you like to say something, Moises?
I lowered my hand on purpose just to make room for others to speak.
Oh, okay.
No.
But we still have just a couple of minutes if you
If
would
I
like to.
may add anything just quickly, I think pragmatics is a very rich area to look at issues of colonization in ELT. I've been doing some work on the pragmatics of English language textbooks that are intended to prepare students to take the Cambridge C1 test. And there are a lot of argumentative and pragmatic structures that are assumed to be natural, specifically when debating points in these conversation tasks of the speaking paper of the C1 test, that are really different from the pragmatic norms that my students have. And so they're not natural at all, but they're presented as natural. And they are much more invisible than grammar or vocabulary because they have to do with values. And they also are very strongly intertwined with social class. I mean, they are the norms of the British upper class, you know, the Oxbridge set that are represented in the privileged ways of arguing in those conversations. Not every British person speaks like that, yet my Mexican students, who many of whom are Maya and many of whom are very poor, are expected to learn those conventions and debate as if they were members of the British upper class. So that's, you know, a paradox and a very, very clear example of coloniality in ELT. So yeah, pragmatics might be a very rich area to explore these issues. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Moises. I don't know if you would like Sonia or we to say something about that.
Yes, thank you, Moises. You do bring up an excellent point there in that I think, as we've been saying, communication is about a lot more than just the linguistic forms. But of course, we need, if we're going to extend it and look and teach pragmatics, we need to be very careful that we don't just reproduce the same kind of colonial ideologies with the other aspects of communication. And you bring up an excellent example of pragmatics, which, yes, it's an area I've looked at myself as well. And the pragmatic strategies and textbooks are, I mean, I don't recognize them often as a British English native speaker because they are of a certain, as you said, an upper class and often one that's much older than most people now. You know, lots of these pragmatic strategies were documented maybe 30, 40 years ago, and they're completely irrelevant now. So it's really important when we extend teaching beyond just linguistic forms that we don't reproduce those same kind of colonial ideologies, that recognize that there are other ways of communicating, and not just other linguistic forms. There are other pragmatic strategies, there are other values, and as you said, class is a big part of that as well. So yeah, I think you bring up some excellent points there.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Moises, for your comments and also for your. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Sorry, I thought it was closed, my mic. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your presence here today, and for the comments, for the questions, for your attendance. All these are very rich in terms of this. I was commenting to Will and Sonia, this is quite a new topic in Mexico about the not exactly about decolonizing, but all the way in which English as a lingua franca studies are presented here, and also how they impact or have implications in English language teaching, and all what is related to syllabus as well, or materials, or even what Moises have phrased now about the pragmatics as well, and the language. So all these are very, I think, welcome to know, to learn, to maybe to think, to have something to think about, and then get what is useful, really useful for us. As Will and Sonia said, the intention was not just to come and present something that is compulsory, that we have to follow that. These are just, we are just exchanging ideas. We are just knowing what we think about related to these different points in terms of decolonizing. And of course, we hope this have been, this activity has been as rich as I think we think we are for everybody here. And again, thank you very much for coming and being here until now, because we have already passed 24 hours. I mean 24 minutes after 6 for the discussion. And thank you, Will and Sonia, for coming and being here with us and sharing this brand new ideas for Mexican people, and also for the Universidad Veracruzana, de San Luis Potosí, Sonora, de Pedagógica Nacional, Guanajuato, the Panamericana Zamorano, del Caribe, and all the universities that have joined today with this interesting talk and sharing of ideas. Of course, UCRO and Durango, and I'm sorry if I missed one, Universidad Nacional de Mexico, and all others. Thank you very much. We hope you have an excellent evening, and hopefully we will meet in another academic moment that we can share together. Okay, thank you very much, and have a good night or evening, depending on where you are. Here in Cozumel, it's evening, it's afternoon still. Okay, bye, thank you.
Thanks very much from us as well.
Thank
It's been an
you.
excellent
Thank you
discussion.
very
Thank
much,
you.
and it was nice to see you, Sonia and Will. Enjoy the rest of the week and the days in
Thank
Mexico.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for sharing.
Bye,
Thank
Marisa.
Bye, bye,
And
Chela,
everyone.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.